just to let you know.
Okay, we've started recording, so we're all good to go.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the final installment of the Project Planning webinar series. In tonight's session, we'll be taking you through two of the assessment tasks. That's assessment task number 2, and the final assessment for this unit in Project Planning, which is assessment task number 3. So we'll be splitting the session into 2 half-hour blocks each for each of those assessments. We'll be taking you through what myself and Alyssa will be looking for as far as your submissions are concerned. We'll be talking about what sort of content that you may like to put in your submissions, and we'll be giving you opportunity also for those who are in the live feed to ask some questions at the end as well. So for the students that are in the live feed, actually, if you do have any questions during the session, we actually do encourage that conversation. So you're welcome to actually, at the moment your microphones are on mute, you are welcome to put something in the chat window, and if you'd like to, if you'd like to join the conversation, just put something in the chat window and Alyssa will then unmute your microphone and you can join the conversation. Alternatively, you can wait till the end when we turn off the recording if you feel more comfortable that way, that's also okay. Alyssa, did you want to add anything before we get a start on assessment task number 2 in project planning?
No, I think we could probably just move straight into the last couple of assessments if you're happy to move on.
Sounds good. So should we do maybe a quick brief summary of what assessment task 1 is? I'm sure the majority of the guys that are here would already know.
Yep.
Just as a quick one, the first task is requiring you to put together basically a brief for a project of your choice. And really what we're wanting to see there is just an outline, a plan, a scope, a brief of the project, who's involved, human resources, materials involved, reporting mechanisms and the quality mechanisms that you've got in place. It's just the overview. These 2 next assessments really kind of lift off from there. So the first one is just an overarching sort of summary. It's a plan for a particular project. In assessment task 2, we actually just look a little bit deeper into the ways that you can monitor and assess your project milestones. So we'll be talking about that. And then in project number 3, we'll be looking at the legislative components that need to be considered in all projects as well. So we'll be talking about the different pieces of legislation and how they may relate to your project. And so that's it, guys. So we'll take you through starting off with assessment number 2. So the way to navigate it, as you would normally do, you would go to your project planning course homepage, and at the bottom, underneath all of the lessons and the learning activities, you'll see the assessment tasks. Just click on assessment task number 2, and that'll take you to the summary of what you are required to do. Alyssa, would you like to read out what we've got on the screen there?
Sure. In this assessment, you're required to show how you would monitor and evaluate the success of the previous project plan in relation to timelines and financial budgets. Upload your completed assessment as a Word document. Create a report of 500 words documenting what system you will use to monitor and assess your project milestones and timelines, and report to stakeholders. You will need to consider how you will report on project progress, performance, communication with team members, coordination of team meetings, feedback sessions, and then we want you to make sure that you respond to what actions will you need to take when milestones are missed, and how will you develop a contingency plan, and how will this fit within your project plan. So that's the first part of that particular assessment. So I guess the assessment itself is really divided into 2 parts, and I guess we go through the first part first. But essentially that first part is designed to really get you to focus on how you're monitoring and assessing your project milestones and timelines. Now, what is important is that you keep the project consistent through the 3 assessments. So the project scope and the project that you've been discussing in assessment number 1 needs to carry over into this assessment. So it's really important that you're bringing and you're contextualizing your project into your responses for assessment task 2 and then ongoing into assessment task 3 as well. Okay? Essentially we're looking at about 500 words. So I think what we should do, Adam, might be just best to kind of like break each one down if you would like to, and I guess take it from that perspective. Has anybody?
Sorry, go for it.
Has anybody actually started this assessment yet? Just a quick Any takers for any starting yet?
I do. Look, I have a number of my students that have completed this and have started this as well, so yes.
Cool. Okay, cool. Okay, well, how about we start at that very, very first part there, Adam. So create a report, documenting what system you will use to monitor and assess your project milestones and timelines and report to stakeholders. Okay, so this part of the actual assessment itself is really about you showing us what systems you are going to use to make sure that your project is meeting the required timelines and meeting the actual milestones that you've set yourself. Now, I believe, just as an overview, in Assessment 1, we did talk about timelines and we did talk about project milestones as well and how you report to our stakeholders. Is that correct, Adam?
Absolutely, yeah. I do believe so, yes.
Yes, cool. So I guess it would be really just expanding on some of the ideas that you had in the first part of your assessment and really showcasing, I guess, what I would be looking for is really the system you're using. So if we have a look at that very first one, which is project progress. So the project progress is really just, I guess, looking at your project milestones and just making sure that you're progressing in context to the time, that you're meeting all of those objectives that you, I guess, essentially started with, and really telling us what system that you're going to use. How are you going to make sure that that project is moving in the right direction and is moving in the direction that you need it to move in? Okay, so I guess the word there and the key word there is really system. We need you to, we kind of need something that really shows us that you're able to determine whether or not it is progressing. So some of the systems that you might have identified in your previous assessment task can now be moved over into this assessment task, particularly when you talked about monitoring, and really start to expand on those types of systems. Adam?
Yep, absolutely. So the guys did actually have to identify, I think it was 3 measures of success for their project in the first example, and they were just asked to explain why they picked that one. So just explain why that one is relevant to their particular project. So they might have used the measure of, get in time or on budget, for example, as a measure of success, and they'll explain, well, it was a festival, it was a seasonal decoration for the city, so we needed to get it done by a particular time, and which is why I was measuring the success on the project or the project milestone success based on the timelines of things we're getting done. That's fine. So really what we want you to do, as Alyssa says, is talk about the systems and how you're going to actually do that. So really just expand on those points that you've made in the first one.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how you're going to go about, really the first 2. And again, like guys, the way we like to see it is you can actually, the first, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines there, 8 lines, from project progress all the way down to how to develop a contingency plan for this. You can actually just put your answers underneath each one of those dot points, and that's a really good way to display the first part of this. Second part's a little bit different. We've got a bit of a template for you. I'll show you that shortly. But just to go through that, really, just put your answers under each of the first 2, each of those dot points. The first 2 are quite similar, so progress and performance are going to be quite similar in terms of how you're going to, what the systems you're going to use and how would you know whether it's been successful or unsuccessful. So that's what we want to know, how you're going to measure the actual performance of your given project. Communication with team members. What we want to see here is how you actually document your communications with your team members and where you do that. So this is all about, remember, this is all about reporting. This is all about assessing. This is all about evaluating. This is all about, I guess, just monitoring things as they're progressing through the actual project. So think of project task 1 as your plan. 2 is, now that everything's underway, how we're going to monitor how things are progressing, how we're going to measure the performance of things, how we're going to communicate with our team members, and in fact how we're going to document that communication as well, because as you would have answered already in some of your learning activities, it's important to document all the communications for team meetings and communications with your team members as well. Likewise, underneath that, coordination of team meetings, we want to know also how you plan to document those. and coordinate those. So everything needs to be documented and coordinated, so we want to know what your systems and processes are for doing that. And then the very last point that I've got there is feedback sessions. So for this one, Alyssa, I'm looking for really how often the guys are going to be doing, how they're going to be gathering the feedback and how often they're going to do it, and then obviously at the end how they're going to document and report on that as well.
Yeah.
So how they're going to document it and then let other people know, other stakeholders know of some of the feedback that's been gathered.
Yeah, no, I absolutely
How do you feel about
agree.
that?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree on that. Like with your feedback systems, we want to know what system, or feedback sessions, we want to know what systems would work that you're going to use. What are the best feedback systems that you can use for your particular project? In some cases, the feedback sessions and the way we do or gather feedback might be very different, but obviously it is just about making sure that, you know, you have a good system that's relevant to your project and you're using it and how you're using it to be able to monitor, you know, the overall success of that project. So, yeah, get in there and, you know, obviously make it specific to your project and make sure it's relevant to your project.
That's the big key for me too, Alyssa. The big key here is that it's relevant, you know, and that's the everything there. So, yeah, there's many different ways that you can gather feedback. There's many different ways you can get people together in a room, have a meeting. There's many different ways you can, you know, communicate with people. But we want to see that it's relevant to your particular project and your particular operation. So, you know, if you've got workers, if your project's Australia-wide or global, then we want to see that you've considered that. And so when you're coordinating, you know, communications with people, that you're considering different time frames, that you're considering people that are different places. So just to say a one size sort of fits all, we'll have a morning meeting in the coffee room, it may not be, you know, a good enough sort of explanation on how you're going to be communicating and coordinating those meetings. Consider it, and you know, as it's got to be a flow on from your task one, but remember, consider it from the bigger picture.
Yep.
The bigger the better, because then you'll get the theory right. There's a couple more questions for this first part, so let's have a look at those. I've got what have we got there? What actions will you need to take when milestones are missed? So the guys, what they did in the first one is that they listed, I think it was around about 5 to 10 project milestones. So what they've effectively done is they've got their project, they've broken that down into smaller chunks, little mini milestones, and what we want to know is what actions are you going to take when your milestones are missed. So for me, you can probably do this in one of two ways. You can either provide an example of one of your milestones and give us an actual version of what you're going to do to solve that particular problem. That's one way of doing it. Or you can just generically answer that as far as a system or a process that you're going to put into place, that when milestones are missed, then, you know, this is my contingency for when that happens. And yeah, that's the way I'm sort of looking at this one.
Yep.
Probably a bit of both. How do you look at this question, Melissa?
No, that's exactly right. I guess the important element there is, you know, monitoring your project to make sure that, you know, you are on track with, I guess, how you've kind of designed it to be. And I think the important thing there is just understanding what you need to do if you realise that a milestone has been missed. So again, the whole focus of this assessment is really about monitoring and assessing how you're progressing through a project. So that, you know, I'm looking for the same thing that you're looking for, Adam. So yeah, and again, just that relevance to your own project is always really important from my perspective. So just don't forget to really connect to that project in your answer.
And then there's really one more question which sort of sums up the first part of this second assessment, which is how will you develop a contingency plan? Now for me this is kind of similar to the question before that, in terms of what actions you need to take when milestones are missed, because what we're looking for is what your process is. How are you going to ensure that your risk management processes that you're putting in place are done properly? How are you going to bring everybody together? So, you know, and consider it in terms of the big picture as well. If you're doing a project that's on a large scale, you might have stakeholders that are all over the country, and you might want to be talking about, you know, how you're going to involve all of your guys, how you're going to coordinate involvement from all of the stakeholders in this particular project. So really we want to see what your process is.
Yeah.
how you're going to sort of put it together. And there's a second, so who you're inviting, how you're going to facilitate the sessions, how you're going to organise your team to develop this plan, really. We don't want to know what your risks are because you've already told us what they are in one. We want to know is how you're going to, put this together. So how would you, as I said, how would you invite people? Who are you going to invite? How are you going to get them together? Are you actually going to invite them to a particular place? Is that how you're going to do it? Maybe you have another way of doing it. Tell us how you're going to be going about it. And we also want to know how that's going to fit in with your project plan.
Yeah. Yes.
So what do you understand that second part of the question to be, Alyssa?
Well, I would imagine that how will this fit into your project plan? Hopefully the whole concept of contingent would have actually fit into your actual planning phase of your project when you're looking at things like the scope and your project plan itself. So that's kind of what I would be looking for. I'm looking for, how will you develop your contingency plan? So again, Adam said it, consultation is always a great thing. And just obviously having the involvement of your team and ensuring that that's a big part of the initial phases of your plan when you start to implement projects. So I would be looking for that type of element in that answer to make sure it's being considered in that scoping phase.
That's it. So you really just have to let us know that it is part of that phase of the project and explain why it's an important part of that initial phase, and we're happy. So if you explain that, then you've got it.
Yep.
Let's move on to the second half of this. The second half of this is really required. So that's the first half.
Yep.
It's obviously all about how you're going to be, what your mechanisms are, how you're going to be reporting, what your processes are for organising team members and communications. So that's great. Second part is we want you to actually to do the financials for your particular project. So we want you to determine what the expenditure may be involved with your particular project plan, and there's a whole bunch of different costs that we're asking from you here. So whether that's capital expenditure, labour costs, cost of materials, supplies, whatever it might be, we want you to include those. What we've done for you, and so I might get you to navigate back out to the project planning course homepage. Right underneath assessment task 2, you'll see there's an Excel spreadsheet, and this is your budget template. Now, a lot of you guys may or may not have done any sort of form of budgeting in the past before. We wanted to give you a template so that you could sort of see exactly what it should look like and how to use it. You may be required to do things like this similarly down the track, and you'll need to obviously put that together yourself going forward. But the main thing that we're looking for here in your budget is a couple of things. One, we want to see that you've actually researched the costs associated with your particular project.
Sorry,
so
Adam,
when we say research,
can I just disturb you? Are you happy for me to open? Can you see the screen where it has actually got the template in there?
No, I can only just see your your Internet Explorer, unfortunately.
Okay, so you can't see where it's located?
No, I can't see it.
Okay, because I was just showing them where we actually had the template in terms of the actual underneath the assessment here. So
okay, well we don't need to open the template. The guys can do that themselves. So that's absolutely fine. So everybody, that's where it's located. It's located underneath the second assessment task, under the assessment category. So click on that one. Yep, as when you click on it, it downloads depending on your browser, as it's done for Alyssa there. Open it up and then start filling in the cost. Oh, it is actually going to open up on your screen now. Okay, that's good. That's good.
Okay.
As I said, there's a couple of components to this. One, we want to see that you've researched the cost. So what we mean is we want to see some sort of realistic figures. So if you're, refurbishing a new hotel in the city, that's your project, then, we don't want to say see $50 for, labour cost or anything like that. That's just ridiculous. We want to see that it's research or cost fittings, particular fittings that you might be, research, have a look how many do they cost? What's the estimated amount of these that we are going to need? It doesn't have to be absolutely exact, but it needs to be pretty close. We feel that your numbers are off, then we're going to send it back and ask you just to research them.
Yep.
So that's the first part. So we want, one, realistic figures as close to as possible.
Yep.
Two, what we want to see is that you've considered as many different costs as possible. If Alyssa and I can consider a few that you've missed out, then we're going to be wanting you to add a few more. So do you have a number that you're looking at in terms of how many items you would like to see here, Alyssa, on this particular budget?
I think it depends on the size of the project. So I'm just going to have a look at the size of the project, or depending on, like, because some projects might involve more labour, more materials. So what I will do is I will just, and this is, to be honest, I'll just have a look at your project. I'll go through all of the elements that you've identified in terms of the physical resources as well as the human resources that you've identified in your scope, and then I'm probably going to match the two across just to make sure that you've identified and you've addressed all of those costs. So that's my kind of thought process on there. I don't know if I'm looking for a specific amount of a specific number. I guess I'm just going to kind of compare it with the scope and the project plan. Where they've identified it, and I'll have a look at it, and I'll have a look. I mean, I would be expecting, I would probably be expecting maybe 4 different cost points per centre, really.
So what, 15 to 20 different costings?
So maybe 4, at least 4 costings per cost centre.
Okay, so let's go through them really quickly. Direct labour, it's labour. Capital equipment, so it's actual equipment, it's fixed equipment. So can you scroll down, please? Okay, so materials, there's some resources obviously that you need. Financials, can you keep going down? So, consider everything. That includes financials. And when we're talking about financial considerations, you might be considering things like how you're going to be getting the money for the project to begin with. Are you going to be taking out a loan? If you are taking out a line of credit, there's money that needs to be paid back in interest each period. So consider all of the costs. Consider some of the, the legal costs of your budget. If it's such a big project, then you possibly will be getting some sort of, legal advice. You might be putting some sort of, absolutely, some, solicitor costs, fees. A couple of things like that. If we see that you've sort of just considered it from all areas, then we're going to be pretty satisfied.
There we go. And I guess
no, that's perfect.
It really just does depend on the type of project that you're going to be doing as well. So some projects will have different costs associated with them that will be quite predominant. Other projects might have different cost centres that you'll be really focusing on. So I'm just going to be looking at, I guess, the general project and have a look at some of the costs and make sure that you've identified and addressed the costs that initially you discussed in your scope as well. So that's my line of thought for that one, Adam.
I've put a little thing there for gifts and donations. So if the guys are like it might be a project that gets interest from the public that the public want to donate to. If that's the case, you can put it on your budget, but it becomes a negative amount because it's money coming inwards rather than outwards. So just be aware of that. Also, we're only interested in your projected costs. The actual costs are there for you to use this particular budget as a means of measuring the project progress and performance.
Yep.
This is maybe one of the systems that you're going to use, potentially. But really we only want to see what your projected costs are at this stage because obviously it hasn't eventuated or most likely hasn't eventuated. So really this is the second part is to fill out this. Yep. There's a couple of questions to then answer on conclusion of filling out this. Yep.
I'm just going to go back into the assessment task. Hold on, tick.
Yeah, you'll see them there. So everywhere in the second half where you see where it says determine the expenditure, so then it lists all of the different types of costs, that's your budget. So just apply the budget, that's fine. And then you can add these 3 questions at the bottom, so 4 questions at the bottom, just add them to your initial Word document. So really part A with the questions up the top, your budget, and then these 3 questions here. Yep. You can effectively include these 3 questions as part of part A if you want to look at it that way. Because you've got questions and then you've got a budget. So whichever way you want to look at it, that's fine. Let's have a look at what the actual questions are. The first question is asking, and the reason why we're calling this Part B is because it's in reference to the finances. Detail how you intend on monitoring the project finances. So you've already told us how you're going to be monitoring the project progress already in Part A, or wanting to know specifically how you're going to be monitoring the project finances. That should be a pretty straightforward one. Yep. What reporting formats will you use? That's the next one.
Yep.
So how are you going to do it again?
Yep. What formats will you use? What documentation might you choose to use to be able to report on financials? I would probably also maybe be inclined to throw in there even your reporting timelines as well. So that would also kind of be in context. So we get a regular update as to how you're performing or you're tracking and how when you're communicating that information to your stakeholders and in what format. So what reporting systems do you use? Just general things like that. Don't be too concerned about the word format. I would just be looking for how you're going to be presenting that information and probably how frequently you would be doing it in terms of timelines, I guess. So.
Yep. So how are you going to monitor it? How are you going to report on it? The next question is what procedures will you set up to communicate with stakeholders, the project team? So this one is specifically in relation to expenses. We're wanting to know about the finances. You're not going to include all stakeholders within the project on communication about project financials. So really we just want you just to identify, I guess, the stakeholders that you will be engaging with to communicate in reference to your projected budgets and monitoring of your financials. And, when you're talking about your reporting in the previous question, who are the people that you're going to be reporting to? This is what this question is asking. The last one here is how will you determine levels of authority and decision-making linked to financials? Really, I'm wanting to know who's managing the budget, who decides. That's what I'm looking for there. So in this one, is it a group decision? Is it do departments send their request to a centralised team to review it and accept or deny? How is it going to work? So you think about it on a big project. We've got a budget. People are going to need money at different times or buy different things, or things are going to happen, things change. What are the systems? Who manages that? Who decides? Who's the decision maker for different things? But just give us an overarching, determine the levels of authority. So who are the decision makers when it comes to financials? And what's the rough process, I guess, that you go about it? That's all we'd like to see there.
Yeah. All right. I guess, I think, does anybody really have any questions? I think if you kind of just really section it out and you have your Part A and then you just look purely at the financials for Part B, and, Adam's designed a great little budget there as well for your use, which is going to help you so much. And I guess what we're asking for is just really to make those figures as accurate as you can. In terms of when I say accuracy, just making sure that you do a bit of research on costs. So just that, just obviously lay it out like that, and just obviously put in that little bit of work that's related just to that second part, particularly with the costs. But obviously costs are really important, so we need to obviously factor that.
And there's many different things that you consider as well. I mean, the more obscure that you put in there, then the happier we'll be, because we will see that you've demonstrated a consideration to various different types of costs and what has to be put into a budget. So that's what we're looking for there. So that would be great. Yeah.
Any questions? Let's have a look. Oh.
Yep. Okay. Let's have a look at assessment task number 3, shall we?
All right, let's move on.
Beautiful.
Okay.
So assessment task number 3. Now that just effectively follows on. This assessment, I'll read it through again. Just you navigate it in exactly the same fashion. This assessment requires you to show how you research relevant legislation linked to your project plan. So in this one, you're actually required to send us a Word document and refer to various different types of legislation. So again, we're going to split this into 2 sections. What we might do is just have a look at each of those sections. I guess, yeah, so we're going to be looking at things like anti-discrimination laws, codes of practice, environmental acts, workplace health and safety, legislations, privacy laws in Australia, and what we're looking for is a 500-word summary of the above mentioned. So you see that there's 5 subcategories: anti-discrimination, code practice, environmental, WHS, privacy laws. We want a 500-word summary explaining how each of these policies may impact on a project plan. So it's a minimum of 500 words. It's not a lot. So really what we're looking for is just an overall kind of summary of how that particular law or act might play out in reference to planning a particular project. Now, Alyssa, before we continue, do you want this to also be, does that need to be contextualized? Because the way I understand that is that it just needs to be a generalized description.
Yep.
There is, I think it becomes contextualized in part.
Yeah, it does. So
yeah.
what we essentially are looking for is really just making sure that that first part, so obviously the 500-word summary explaining how each of these policies may impact a project. So what we want to do is we want you to write 500 words, very generalised about how these types of policies will affect a project. Then in the second part, as Adam's mentioned, we want you to contextualise it. So we want you to use the information and your understanding of each of these policies in context to your own project that you started back in Assessment 1. So I would be looking for a real general overview and an understanding of the importance that these pieces of legislation have on an actual project. And then the second part I would definitely be looking for in terms of just contextualising it to your individual project. So we see that you can apply that information. That's the most important part.
So, yeah, absolutely. So again, guys, we'd like you to use what's on the actual sheet there to set up your document or to format your response. So with this particular section, Part A, the way that I would do it would be just to use each of those subsections, each of those bullet points as your own, effectively your own subsections, just so that we can see that you understand what each of those components mean, because each of them asks to refer to something different. Now, Alyssa and I will go through each of those now with you. So starting with the first one, which is anti-discrimination laws. Now actually anti-discrimination laws in Australia could refer to a number of different things that operate actually at a federal level. So we're looking at things like the Age Discrimination Act of 2004, the Australian Human Rights Commission Act of 86, Disability Discrimination Act of 92, the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975, and also includes the Sexual Discrimination Act of 1984. Another interesting component of that is that when you are referring to these acts, we want you to refer to the act with their year associated. These acts do get amended, and those amendments are very, very relevant. So referring to the incorrect year is effectively referring to the incorrect piece of legislation. So you do need to actually make reference to the full title, which includes the actual year. So I guess the way to go about this, guys, is, as I said, just set up your paper with each of those 5 different sections. So firstly, anti-discrimination laws. There's a great website, and this is a really big tip for all of you guys. There's a great website called humanrights.gov.au, and I've actually put this link on. It's not much of a tip anymore because I've put it up on the website. If you look under your supplementary materials list on your project planning homepage, you'll see the supplementary materials list. I've put a link to this particular website there for you, and this website's absolutely fantastic. What it does, it actually gives you a... Sorry, can you guys hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, sorry, apologies, just went really quiet then.
Yeah.
Yep, no worries. So this website actually gives you a beautiful background and really short explanation on how each of these anti-discrimination laws, what they refer to, what they mean, what the areas that they cover, and just a brief process for decision making and how it's sorted. So, really using that bit of information, you should be able to apply it to any given project and just explain in a short sort of form, how this policy might impact on a project. So, for example, you might talk about the Age Discrimination Act. How might that apply Well, it might actually apply to the selection process of hiring staff for your particular project. It's something that needs to be considered. That's exactly what we're wanting you to sort of refer to. So that sort of thing. Let's go through each of the different 5 and sort of just do a quick explanation. I think that might be the way to go. You will see there's a website called, I'm not sure what it's actually called, but if you actually type in the full title, so if you type in Racial Discrimination Act 1975, for example, you will see one of the links will actually be the actual act, because they are available for anybody to have a look at. They're freely available. You can actually see the actual act. Acts themselves, it's very worthy to have a bit of a look at it, just to have a look and see. They are themselves quite detailed and a little bit lengthy, and there's all the different ratifications and amendments and definitions and what does this word mean, and refer to that and refer to this. It might be a little bit too difficult to go through the actual act to find the information, but it's definitely a good way it's a good thing to have a look at in any case, just so that you know that they're there. So let's have a look at the next one. So that's what we want you to do for the anti-discrimination laws. Codes of practice. So just to kind of clarify, codes of practice and things like compliance code, it's another way of referring to these things. Compliance codes generally are they're practical guides, I guess, for those that have duties or obligations under, workplace health and safety or occupational health and safety. So they're really, codes of practice are really just a guide or a way to understand and how to comply with various different things. So let's give an example so an example would be, I've got here, communicating across different languages is a compliance code. I've got a guide here. So, for example, in Victoria, WorkSafe are the body that take care of all of the occupational health and safety, acts and compliance codes and so on and so forth. And it's actually probably depending on where you are. So what's the body in New South Wales, Alyssa? WorkCover, is that right?
WorkCover, yeah. So it's obviously when it comes to things like work health and safety and some of these pieces of legislation as well, some of them might differ slightly depending on where you're currently located. So obviously we would be looking at the relevant state-based legislation if applicable. So, WorkCover looks after the practices and the compliance of work health and safety in New South Wales, and you guys have Safe Work Australia? Is it Safe Work Australia or yeah?
Safe Work is the national body that actually oversees all of the state versions thereof. That's Safe Work. But compliance codes or codes of practices are really just sort of guides that people can use to how to handle, asbestos, for example. There's a code of practice on that, so it shows you how to actually, some of the processes for actually handling it, for example. So it just helps those that have really these codes of practice are things that just help those that have an obligation to workplace health and safety understand how better to handle that particular area. So the way to find some of these is to go and find your state provider. If it's Victoria, WorkSafe, New South Wales, WorkCover, and have a look for some of the compliance codes or codes of practices for that particular state. So that's what I would do for that one.
Yeah.
So let's have a look at the third one. Is that sort of clear? Are we happy with that? Should we move on to that one?
Yeah, let's move on to environmental, work health and safety and privacy, because I think there's considerable detail that can still go in here. And for 500 words, you might struggle with you could write 5,000 words about this. It's just
you probably could.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to fit it in a condensed version. So yeah.
That's why we want you to speak generally, so you do need to research, and that's why you do need to have a look and see some of the different compliance codes and some of the different codes of practices, because you need to be able to summarise it and generically say, here are the kind of areas that are covered here, and these are the considerations, and this is why it relates to, this is why they need to be considered, and this is why it relates to the planning phase of a project. That's really what we're looking for.
Yep.
If you look at the next one, which is environmental, these are you'll see that these are what we're looking for are acts that are administered by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and there is effectively an Environmental Protection Act, Act of 1970, and look, the Act is there with the basic philosophy of preventing pollution and environmental damage by setting some environmental quality objectives and setting some programs to meet those. There is 3 or 4 others as well, which include there's something called the National Environmental Protection Council Act of 95. I've got written down here. There's something called the pollution of waters by oil and other things as well. But there's a few in there. The way to go about that one, guys, is to have a look at the website epa.vic.gov.au. Well, that's how I found it here locally. You might have other means of finding those acts administered by the EPA. Have a look for those.
And just interestingly, just interestingly enough as well, I think there's a new code of practice or series of standards in New South Wales. Obviously, I'm based in New South Wales when it comes to environmental compliance. Now, especially if you're a company and perhaps you are taking on a new project where you are building or utilising a piece of the environment, there are regulations now in place about ensuring that as part of your project scope that you actually showcase your the environmental sustainability of your actual building now. So it's all very interesting, and it does depend on the actual standards in place when it comes to when it does come to your states as well. So it's a bit of an interesting read if you're interested in the environmental aspects of legislation. So sorry, I was just throwing out that out there for a practical example.
Yes, but if you basically get an overview of what the Environmental Protection Act talks about, then you'll kind of get an idea of what it's, we don't need to know the actual ins and outs of the law, but we just want to know that, why does it need to be considered? Why does, the disposal of waste need to be considered? And why are you considering that as part of your plan? So just let us know that, and then we know that you understand vaguely, or not vaguely, but you have a general understanding of what that particular legislation is there for and why it needs to be considered, and then we're pretty happy. So then is there one more section there?
No, there's actually 2. So you've also got 2 of the biggies. Obviously, you've got things like work health and safety. Again, it doesn't matter, I guess, whatever you're embarking on. Work health and safety is a massive piece of legislation in this particular country. And as Adam's already mentioned, obviously, depending on where you are, you could approach or you could research or use the internet to give you a nice overview of things like work health and safety. Body is different from Victoria as opposed to New South Wales, but they do offer a really nice overview. And I guess whatever you do.
Alyssa, sorry, I'll have to cut you off there. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I will have to cut you off. What's actually happening in Australia is that workplace health and safety laws are been coming in over the last few years to replace all of the state occupational health and safety laws that had been previously in place. So, for example, as you were saying, you're spot on, how Victoria and New South Wales, everybody's got their own, body that regulates the occupational health and safety laws. What they're actually doing is now try to effectively harmonise all of those occupational health and safety laws across each of the different states. Actually, from the 1st of January 2011, they brought in this new work health and safety law, which is effectively aiming just to sort of be an overarching version thereof. And so this is on a federal level as well.
Yep.
And so for something to get through workplace health and safety, it has to be passed by Parliament and in government. And ironically enough, Victoria, one of the few states that aren't involved at the moment.
Yeah, and WA as well, just due to the obviously the actual mining industry over there. They also have a standalone piece of legislation too. So yeah, you're right. That was kind of introduced back in 2011, just to kind of give a bit of an overall umbrella to how we practice and how we comply with work health and safety. So some states are still standalone, but ideally it would be nice to have everybody under the same branch. But I can see from the perspective of what your environment produces and what issues kind of are associated with work health and safety in your state. So it is definitely an interesting debate. And if anybody's ever read the work health and safety piece of legislation out there, the Act. It's about 40 million pages long and it's forever having additions to it. So the beauty of this law is that we can never account for every incident or accident or anything that occurs, and anytime something new occurs, it gets added to the legislation, and the actual legislation itself is quite massive. So it's a very interesting, evolving piece of legislation. So, yeah.
Yep. Just to let the guys know how to deal with this one, Safe Work. Go to safeworkaustralia.gov.au or just type Safe Work into a Google search. Safe Work Australia are the overarching body that I guess coordinates and develops the national policies and strategies and assists with the implementation of these different legislations. If you actually do a Google search on guide, so if you actually type in guide to WHS Act, there's a PDF file which is a, what I call an easier version or a simplified version of what's included in there and how to understand it and how to make sense of it. And that is all you need to do. If all the guys do for this particular section is just look for that PDF file. So just do a search for guide to WHS Act. It opens up this PDF file that gives more than enough information about what WHS means in Australia and how that may impact in terms of project planning and things like that. So that's all they'll need to do on that one.
And there's that very last one just there, that the privacy laws. So obviously having a bit of an exploration of the Privacy Act. I think, so just having obviously a bit of a look at the Privacy Act and getting a bit of an overview. I don't know if have you attached a link for the Privacy Act, Adam?
Yeah, I did actually, or I put a link there where there's some information for you. Excellent. But I'm happy for the guys to kind of discover this for themselves.
Yep.
So I actually haven't put any links up for students on this one. I have for the guide to some of the discrimination laws because that could have been a little bit difficult getting started. The other ones, it's up to you guys to do a bit of research yourself. So what we would actually suggest, the actual act, I think it's the Privacy Act of 1988.
Yep. Oh,
just double check that, guys. So do a Google search.
Is it 98? I think it's 98. So yeah.
88. 1988. Yeah. So I believe it's 88. I might be wrong. If somebody who's in the audience wants to do a quick Google search on what the actual Privacy Act year is, that'd be great. But the Privacy Act effectively is an Australian law, which, and this is what I'm reading here as an example, is an Australian law which regulates the handling of personal information about individuals. It effectively includes the collection, the use of that information, how that information about individuals is stored, and and the disclosure of personal information, so when and where people can share or not share disclosed information about somebody or not, and access to that information as well. So this Act covers all of that.
Yep. And if you're living in New South Wales, yeah, we do have what's called the Privacy and Personal Information Protection Act of 1998. So you can always refer, if you live in New South Wales, you can always refer or bring reference to that particular element of the privacy law as well. So, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
We just have to make sure that we know where everybody is.
Yeah. Well, look, guys, we've sort of it sounds like there's a lot, but really we're not asking for a lot. So it's 500 words for that first section. So think about it as 100 words for each of those 5 categories. And really, what you're wanting you to do is just let us know how those laws, acts, or practices, might impact on your project planning. What we do want to see is that you are demonstrating an understanding of what is included in those laws or practices. If you don't show us an understanding, if you just generically answer it, like say, well, people don't know about it, they might get hurt, or something like that, that's not good enough. We want to actually just see a demonstration that you understand what the ramifications or what's included in that particular law or policy, and and that's really it. Is there anything else before we, I guess, just answer the last couple of questions?
No, have fun with that. I mean, like I feel a bit sad for only having 500 words there because there's some really good there's some really good legislation in there, so it's a bit sad. But as we progress through the course as well, there are definite references to additional pieces of legislation and additions to these legislations. So I'm sure you'll be able to add more words eventually as you go through the course. But yeah, just 500 words, nice and basic, just associating with it how they actually impact a project plan. So yeah.
And guys, as business leaders, we're not expected to know the ins and outs of every law. We are absolutely not, but we are expected to have an understanding that there are things out there that we need to work in with. And so when we're part of a team, when we're planning things, when we're organising things, we need to be aware of these considerations, be able to work them into our plan, and that's exactly what we're getting you to do and think about here, which is why you're researching. Let's have a look at each of the last three questions. So the last three questions, how would you include any relevant policies as part of your scope? So for this part, how will you include these in your planning and your scoping phase, these relevant legislations? So really what we want to know is which of the identified policies are required to be considered in your scope. So this is where it comes back to your project. This is where you now contextualize the first half, just a summary of how it all relates and why it might impact in project planning. This one, how will you include any relevant policies as part of your scope? So, you know, how you want to include them in there, what's to be considered, which policies, which legislations are you going to consider in your scope, and how you're going to throw them in there. Alyssa, anything else for that first question?
No, no, just obviously just which piece, as you mentioned, which pieces of legislation are relevant to you. Again, really just want to see that application of that knowledge into your actual project itself. So yeah, no, I've got nothing to add. I mean, I'm happy to move on to that next question if you'd like to. So which would need to be included in your risk management plan, and how would you communicate to your key stakeholders?
Yeah, so for the risk management plan, I'm wanting the guys to actually identify some actual risks, legal risks that are real for this project. So the one before, they're actually identifying which policies, which codes of practice that need to be included for their scope. For this one, I actually want them to identify, so which would need to be included in your risk management plan. Well, I actually like them to identify some of a risk associated with that particular identified piece of legislation that they've just listed beforehand. Sorry, that came out a bit strange. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, no.
Is that what you're looking for as well, Lisa?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, identifying, absolutely. I mean, that's exactly what I would be looking for. Like, I want you to know that, you know, in your risk management plan that you've addressed these kinds of legislative requirements and that there are potential risks for you and the business and team members and stakeholders if they're not complied with. And I guess just identifying, you know, that you have an understanding of that. Yeah. No, Adam, I'm happy with. Yeah, I'm definitely happy with that. You know, yeah.
So yeah. So the first question, how would you include relevant policies? So what pieces of code, what codes practices, what privacy, what legislation, what bits are part of your scope? Specifically, then what needs to be included in your risk management plan? Okay, so identify some actual risks associated with those that you're including in the scope that you mentioned before. And the last one, how do you communicate with stakeholders? So how are you going to communicate these policies and these legals to your stakeholders? So if they are considerations that are on your project, how are you going to inform them of their roles? How are you going to inform them of their responsibilities in relation to the legislative requirements that you've identified?
Yeah, and different key stakeholders will have different responsibilities under different pieces of legislation as well. So just obviously consider how important it is to communicate and how you will communicate to those specific people too. So, yeah.
Yep.
Cool.
In their first assessment, they were asked to identify human resources and key stakeholders. So what I was getting my guys to do is with the human resources to identify some of the job roles, but under key stakeholders to identify some of the groupings of stakeholders, so whether it's customers, whether it's the local council, whether it's the investors in the project, whether it's the internal management, or whether it's peers, workers, whatever it might be, subcontractors. Give us just the groupings of stakeholders. And for this one, really you just have to let us know how you're going to effectively just communicate everybody's legal role, of, you know, what their roles and responsibilities are in relation to those legislative requirements that you identified in that first question.
Initial part, yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
So yeah, does anybody have any questions? I think we might just pop it out to whoever's in the live feed if you have any questions.
It's only 500 words, this one, and I think it was only 500 words for the last one, wasn't it?
So hang on a sec. Let's clarify that actually, because is it 500 words?
No, I think 500 words for the summary, and then for the additional 3 questions, they are additional information, so they're additional word count.
Yes. Correct. That's what I'm looking for too. So 500 words for the first half, which is just one, effectively 100 words for each of those 5 subcategories, talking about them. And then there's no word limit. There's 3 questions at the end there. Just But again, what I'm looking for is if you just put one bit of something. If you're building a brand new premise in the city or whatever you're doing, you're constructing. You've given me nothing on workplace health and safety. You've given me nothing on, on anything like that. Then I'm going to consider that you haven't really thought about it too hard. So, we want to see you really just list as much as possible. More better, the more the better, because it shows us that you're considering those things. So that's the first part of that second part, if you like, the first question. The second one, you're actually going to identify some specific things that are of risk, of legal risk to your project. And that last one is just how you're going to communicate to the general stakeholder groups. So no word count in the second half, but you'll need to, more is going to be better again. So, I think pretty close to 1,000 words, all this one will be about on the money.
Yeah, I think that, yeah. Okay.
Okay, guys, does anybody have any questions?
Questions?
It may be one, these 2 assessments may be just those that you just needed to start jumping into, and you might find that you might have some questions as you get stuck. And if you do, obviously engage with Alyssa and myself, ask us any questions as you go. And the second assessment task, if you're wanting to get a start on that one, you can certainly start by just starting with your budget if you want to start that way. If you want to start by answering the questions on how you're going to monitor and assess and report on your milestones, you can do it that way. For the third assessment task, my suggestion to you is just to list each of those 5 categories onto a Word page, and then start researching. And as you're researching stuff and finding information about stuff or good explanations, examples of things, start feeding that information into your document, and then using that information to explain how it impacts on project planning in general. And then you can answer the last 3 questions at the end. Probably the way to go about doing it. If there are no questions, well, what we might do is turn the recording off. And if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask off air, they're more than welcome to. Thanks very much for your attendance, guys. Looking forward to seeing your submissions here on assessment tasks 2 and 3 in project planning. Just to let you know at this stage, Alyssa, there's no webinars next week. Is that right?
That's correct. We're having a break.
Okay. So there's no webinars next week. We're actually getting prepared for a run of 12 weeks, flat out, of webinars after that. So after next week, it's going to be full on. After that, you'll find it looks like, guys, each of the business and management students will each have an evening and an afternoon session. So we'll be running 1 session a week at 6 o'clock for business and management students, and then 1 session will be run sometime in the afternoon. We'll communicate that to you. Alyssa and I are also going to be running sessions on top of those, just between ourselves, just to throw additional content out there for you guys. So keep an eye out. There's going to be a whole wave of content coming pretty soon. Just keep an eye out for the new schedules coming out, which we'll let you know very, very shortly.
And see, you're right.
Chinese New Year.
It's Chinese New Year, and I always try and practice how I say it, but I never get it right. How I'm supposed to say it. I worked with a lady, and every Chinese New Year she used to tell me how I used to say Happy New Year, and I used to practice and practice and practice, and she'd every year for 7 years she would make me practice it, and every year from 7 years I always had to re-practice all the time. But Happy New Year. It's a good. I think it's a what's the year that we're in?